The funeral lilies were still wilting in their crystal vases when my mother-in-law destroyed my world with 6 words: "Pack your things and get out." Eleanor Sullivan stood in the doorway of what had been my home for 15 years, her black Chanel suit pristine despite the October rain, her silver hair pulled back in the same austere chignon she'd worn to every family gathering where she'd made it clear I would never be good enough for her son. But now James was 3 days buried, and the mask she'd worn for his sake had finally slipped. "I'm sorry?" I said, looking up from the sympathy cards scattered across the mahogany dining table, the same table where James and I had shared thousands of meals, where we'd planned our modest adventures and weathered the storms of his illness together. "Eleanor, I don't understand. Don't you?" Her smile was sharp as winter, cutting through the grief that had been my only companion since watching them lower my husband's casket into the unforgiving earth. "James is gone, Catherine, which means you're no longer under his protection." The words hit me like a physical blow. Protection. As if loving her son had been some kind of elaborate con game, as if the 15 years I'd spent caring for him through cancer treatments and remissions and the final devastating relapse had been calculated manipulation rather than devotion. "This is my home," I said quietly, but even as I spoke the words, they felt hollow. I was 62 years old, a recently retired nurse who'd spent her career savings helping pay for James's experimental treatments. What claim did I really have to this sprawling Georgian mansion in Greenwich, to the life we'd built together in rooms I'd thought would shelter me until my own death? Eleanor laughed, and the sound was like glass breaking. "Your home? Oh, my dear Catherine, you really haven't been paying attention, have you?" She walked to the antique secretary desk, James's grandmother's piece, where he'd handled all our financial affairs, and pulled out a thick manila folder with the efficiency of someone who'd been planning this moment for years. "The house is in James's name," she said, spreading papers across the table like a dealer revealing a winning hand. "As are all the investment accounts, the stock portfolio, the real estate holdings. Did you really think my son would leave his family's fortune to a nobody nurse he picked up at a hospital?" My legs gave out. I sank into the dining room chair where I'd sat just a week ago, watching James pick at the soup I'd made him, both of us pretending he might have enough strength to finish it. The chair where I'd held his hand while he'd whispered promises about how he'd take care of me, how I'd never have to worry about anything after he was gone. "James would never," I started, but Eleanor cut me off with a wave of her manicured hand. "James was a Sullivan, Catherine. We don't throw away 40 years of careful wealth building on sentimental gestures." She leaned forward, close enough that I could smell her expensive perfume mixed with the satisfaction of long-delayed revenge. "He left everything to me, as was proper. The house, the businesses, the 33 million in liquid assets, all of it returns to the Sullivan family where it belongs. 33 million. I'd known James was successful. His real estate development company had thrived even through economic downturns, but I'd never imagined the true scope of his wealth. We'd lived comfortably, but not extravagantly, traveled modestly, made decisions based on contentment rather than luxury. Had I been naive, or had James deliberately hidden the extent of his fortune from me? "You have until Sunday to collect your personal belongings," Eleanor continued, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I'll have the locks changed Monday morning." "Eleanor, please." The words tasted like ash in my mouth. "James and I were married for 15 years. Whatever you think of me personally—" "What I think of you personally," she interrupted, "is that you were a convenient caretaker who kept my dying son company in his final years. Nothing more. And now that he's gone, your services are no longer required." She gathered the papers back into their folder, each movement precise and final. "I'm being generous by giving you until Sunday. Take your clothes, your trinkets, whatever pathetic mementos you've collected, and find somewhere else to die. Because my son isn't here to protect you anymore." The front door slammed with the finality of a judge's gavel, leaving me alone in the suddenly foreign space that had been my sanctuary. I sat in the gathering dusk, surrounded by the detritus of a life I'd thought was permanently mine. The throw pillows I'd carefully chosen, the family photographs that would now be stripped from their frames, the small treasures I'd accumulated during a marriage I'd believed was built on love rather than convenience. My phone buzzed with a text message. James's lawyer, Marcus Rivera, asking me to call him when I had a moment to discuss estate matters. I stared at the message until the words blurred. wondering if he'd be the one to officially confirm what Eleanor had just destroyed me with, that my husband had left me with nothing but memories and the clothes on my back. Instead, I walked through the house like a ghost, revisiting scenes of a life that had apparently been an illusion. The master bedroom where I'd slept beside James for 15 years, where I'd held him through night sweats and morphine dreams, where he'd died holding my hand while whispering words I'd thought were promises. The kitchen where I'd learned to cook his favorite meals, adjusting recipes as his appetite diminished and his needs changed. The sunroom where we'd spent quiet afternoons reading together, his head on my lap while I stroked his hair and pretended the cancer wasn't winning. Had any of it been real? Had James loved me? Or had Eleanor been right? Was I nothing more than an educated caregiver who'd been convenient to keep around while he was dying? I packed mechanically, folding my modest wardrobe into the suitcases I'd bought for vacations we'd rarely taken because James's health had made travel difficult. My jewelry, mostly pieces he'd given me for anniversaries and birthdays, nothing extravagant, but chosen with care. The books I'd collected over a lifetime of reading, the small artwork that had meaning only to me. By Sunday evening, 15 years of marriage fit into 4 suitcases and 3 boxes. I called the number for the extended stay hotel near the hospital where I'd worked for 30 years, making a reservation with the hollow voice of someone whose life had been erased while she wasn't paying attention. The desk clerk was kind but professional, offering weekly rates to a woman who clearly had nowhere else to go. As I loaded my car in the circular driveway where James had carried me over the threshold on our wedding day, I saw Eleanor watching from the living room window. She didn't wave or acknowledge my departure. She simply observed, ensuring that her victory was complete. I drove away from the only home I'd known as James's wife, past the gardens where I'd planted roses that would bloom for someone else next spring, away from the life I'd thought would carry me through whatever years I had left. But as I pulled onto the highway, heading toward a future that felt as dark and uncertain as the October night, something nagged at the edges of my consciousness. James had been many things: loving, thoughtful, generous to a fault, but he'd never been careless. The man who'd spent months researching the perfect anniversary gift, who'd planned every detail of our modest life together with meticulous attention, seemed unlikely to have overlooked something as important as my security after his death, unless Eleanor was lying, or unless there was something she didn't know. I pulled into the hotel parking lot and sat in my car for a long time, staring at my phone where Marcus Rivera's message still glowed on the screen. Tomorrow, I would call him back. Tonight, I would grieve not just for my husband, but for the woman I'd been when I'd believed that love was enough to protect you from the people who'd never wanted you to exist in the first place. But somewhere in the devastation Eleanor had left behind, a small voice whispered that James Sullivan had been too smart, too careful, and too devoted to leave his wife defenseless against the mother who'd never hidden her disdain. Maybe I'd find out I was wrong. Maybe I'd discover that 15 years of marriage had been built on lies and convenience. Or maybe, just maybe, my husband had been protecting me in ways I couldn't yet understand. Tomorrow would bring answers. Tonight brought only the beginning of the longest week of my life. The extended stay hotel room smelled like industrial disinfectant and other people's desperation. I sat on the edge of the bed at 6 a.m, unable to sleep for the 3rd straight night, staring at Marcus Rivera's business card until the embossed letters blurred together. Rivera and Associates, Estate Planning and Probate Law. James had chosen Marcus 15 years ago when we'd first married, insisting we both needed wills, despite my protests that I had nothing worth leaving to anyone. "Everyone needs protection, Kate," he'd said, using the nickname that now felt like an echo from another life, especially the people we love most. I'd thought it was sweet then, typical of James's careful nature. Now I wondered if it had been prophetic. My phone showed 17 missed calls from Eleanor, along with a string of increasingly venomous text messages demanding to know why I hadn't cleared out completely yet. Apparently, my crime was leaving behind the coffee maker James had bought me for my birthday. A small thing, but she'd noticed its absence like a bloodhound scenting weakness. The final message, sent at 2 a.m., read, "Don't make this more difficult than necessary, Catherine. You have nothing left to fight for." Maybe she was right. Maybe I was clinging to false hope because the alternative, accepting that I'd been fool enough to spend 15 years loving a man who'd seen me as disposable, was too devastating to face. But at 6:30 a.m., I called Marcus anyway. "Kate?" His voice was warm, concerned, immediately personal in a way that surprised me. "I've been wondering when I'd hear from you. Are you all right?" "No," I said simply. "Eleanor says James left everything to her. She's had me evicted from my own home." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, long enough that I wondered if we'd been disconnected. Then Marcus made a sound that might have been laughter or disgust. "She did what?" "She threw me out. Said James left her the house, the business, $33 million, everything. Said I was just a caretaker who'd outlived my usefulness." "Kate, where are you right now?" "Extended stay hotel on Route 9. "Why?" "Because we need to talk. Immediately. Don't go anywhere. Don't sign anything. Don't respond to any more of Eleanor's messages. I'm coming to you." "Marcus, if you're trying to be kind, I'm trying to prevent a travesty," he said, his voice sharp with something that sounded like anger. "Kate, whatever Eleanor told you about James's will, she's either lying or she's working with incomplete information. I'll be there in an hour." He hung up before I could ask what that meant, leaving me staring at my phone in the gray morning light filtering through hotel curtains that had seen better decades. Incomplete information. What could that possibly mean? Either James had left me something, or he hadn't. Either our marriage had mattered to him financially, or it hadn't. Unless... I paced the small room, trying to remember the conversations James and I had about the future during those final weeks. He'd been heavily medicated, drifting in and out of consciousness, but there had been moments of clarity when he'd gripped my hand with surprising strength and told me not to worry, that everything would be fine, that I would be taken care of. "You're stronger than you know, Kate," he'd whispered one afternoon when the autumn light had been slanting through our bedroom windows in golden bars. "Stronger than any of them realize. Promise me you'll remember that." I'd thought he was talking about grief, about my ability to survive his death, but maybe he'd meant something else entirely. Marcus arrived at 7:45, carrying a briefcase and 2 cups of coffee from the good place downtown, the one where James and I had shared lazy Saturday mornings before his illness made even small outings exhausting. He was younger than I'd expected from our phone conversations, maybe 45, with kind eyes and the rumpled appearance of someone who'd been working too early or too late. "First things first," he said, handing me a coffee that was exactly how I liked it. "Cream, no sugar. Eleanor Sullivan does not have the authority to evict you from anywhere. But she said James left everything to her." "Eleanor Sullivan inherited exactly what James intended her to inherit," Marcus interrupted, settling into the room's single chair while I perched on the bed. "Which was nothing." I stared at him. "Nothing?" "Nothing. James's will is complex. He was very specific about certain conditions that needed to be met before the primary bequests could be executed." Marcus opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "He was particularly concerned about protecting you from his mother's vindictiveness." "I don't understand." Marcus looked at me with the expression of someone about to deliver news that would change everything. "Kate, James left Eleanor a single item in his will. A first-edition copy of Pride and Prejudice that belonged to his grandmother. Everything else, the house, the business, the investments, every penny of the $33 million Eleanor was so eager to claim, belongs to you." The coffee cup slipped from my numb fingers, splashing across the hotel carpet in a brown stain that would probably outlast my stay. "That's not possible. Eleanor showed me papers. Eleanor showed you preliminary estate documents that James had me prepare as a... let's call it a test." Marcus's smile was grim. He suspected his mother would reveal her true feelings about you once he was no longer alive to protect you. He wanted documentation of exactly how she treated his widow. Documentation? Why? Because James knew Eleanor would contest any will that left you the bulk of his estate. He needed evidence that she viewed you as an outsider, that she had no genuine concern for your welfare, that her interest was purely financial. Marcus pulled out his phone and showed me a voice recording app, which is why he asked me to record any conversations she had with you after his death. My mind reeled. "You've been recording? Eleanor's treatment of you has been documented from the moment she walked into your house Monday morning. Every cruel word, every threat, every attempt to make you believe James had betrayed you." His expression softened. "Kate, your husband loved you more than you can possibly imagine. Everything he did in those final months was designed to protect you from exactly what Eleanor put you through this week. I felt something break loose in my chest, not heartbreak this time, but the opposite. Relief so profound it was almost painful. So the house is yours, the business is yours, the investments are yours. Eleanor has spent the past week living in your property and threatening the actual heir to the Sullivan estate. But why the elaborate deception? Why not just tell me? Marcus was quiet for a moment, studying my face. Because James knew you, Kate. He knew that if you'd understood the true extent of his wealth, you would have insisted on prenups and separate accounts and all the legal protections that rich men use to guard their fortunes. You would have been too ethical to accept it. So he tricked me into inheriting $33 million? He tricked you into accepting the security he wanted you to have. The security you earned by loving him through 15 years of illness and uncertainty, by choosing care over career advancement, by being the kind of partner who put his well-being above your own financial interests. I stood up abruptly, pacing to the window where I could see the highway stretching toward Greenwich, toward the house I'd been exiled from, toward the life I'd thought was lost forever. There's more, Marcus said quietly. More? Kate, the $33 million Eleanor mentioned? That's just the liquid assets, the real estate holdings, the business equity, the investment portfolio. James was worth considerably more than that. You're not just wealthy, you're one of the richest women in Connecticut. I turned from the window, looking at this lawyer who was casually rewriting the fundamental assumptions of my existence. How much more? Including all assets? Approximately $87 million. The number hung in the air like smoke. $87 million. More money than I could conceptualize, more than I'd earned in my entire nursing career. More than I'd ever imagined existing outside of Forbes magazine articles about people who lived in a different universe than mine. Why didn't he tell me? Because he knew it would change how you saw yourself, how you move through the world. James wanted you to love him for who he was, not what he could provide. But he also wanted to ensure that after he was gone, no one, especially his mother, could ever make you feel powerless again. I sank back onto the bed, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what Marcus was telling me. In the space of an hour, I'd gone from destitute widow to, what exactly? Millionaire? Philanthropist? A woman wealthy enough to buy and sell the people who'd dismissed her as a gold-digging nurse? What happens now? Marcus smiled, and for the first time since James's death, I saw something that looked like justice in another person's expression. Now we go to your house and inform Eleanor Sullivan that she's been trespassing on your property for the better part of a week. And Kate? Yes? James left very specific instructions about how this conversation should go. He wanted his mother to understand exactly what she'd lost by treating his wife like hired help. I thought about Eleanor's satisfied smile as she'd watched me pack my life into boxes, about her certainty that she'd finally gotten rid of the inconvenient woman who dared to marry above her station. When do we go? Right now. It's time Eleanor learned what happens when you underestimate a Sullivan, even one who only became a Sullivan by marriage. The drive to Greenwich felt like traveling backward through time, each familiar landmark a waypoint in the dismantling of everything I'd believed about my life. Marcus followed behind me in his BMW, a parade of two heading toward what he'd called the reckoning, though I wasn't sure if he meant Eleanor's or my own. As we turned onto Meadowbrook Lane, the street where I'd lived for 15 years, I felt my hands tighten on the steering wheel. The house rose before us like something from a magazine spread. Georgian architecture, perfectly manicured lawns, the kind of understated elegance that whispered old money rather than shouting new wealth. James had inherited it from his father, and I'd always felt like a visitor there, careful not to disturb the legacy I'd been privileged to share. Now, Marcus was telling me it belonged to me. Eleanor's silver Mercedes sat in the circular driveway like a territorial marker. Through the front windows, I could see lights on in the living room, the warm glow that had once meant home and safety and the promise of quiet evenings with James. She'd made herself comfortable in my exile, settling into possession with the satisfaction of someone who'd waited decades for this moment. Ready? Marcus asked as we met on the front walk. I'm not sure I'll ever be ready for this. Kate, before we go in, I need you to understand something. He paused, studying my face in the late morning light. Eleanor has been living a lie for the past week. She genuinely believes she inherited James's estate. When we tell her the truth, her reaction is going to be intense. What do you mean? I mean that Eleanor Sullivan has spent 60 years believing that family wealth belonged to her by right, that she was temporarily sharing it with James rather than accepting it as his gift. Learning that she now has nothing, and that you have everything, may be more than she can process gracefully. I thought about the woman who'd raised James, who'd attended our wedding with the frozen smile of someone witnessing a mistake she couldn't prevent, who'd spent 15 years treating me like staff at family gatherings. Eleanor had never been graceful about anything that threatened her vision of how the world should work. Is there any chance she could contest the will? None. James was meticulous about the legal framework, and we have documentation of her behavior toward you that would make any judge question her motives. But Kate, Marcus hesitated. Eleanor is going to blame you for this. In her mind, you seduced her son and manipulated him into leaving you his fortune. The fact that James chose to protect you is going to be seen as evidence of your manipulation, not his love. Will you be able to prove James was competent when he made these decisions? Abundantly. We have video testimony, medical records showing his mental acuity remained sharp despite his physical decline, witnesses to his detailed instructions about the estate. Eleanor would have better luck contesting gravity than contesting this will. We climbed the front steps where I'd welcomed guests to dinners I'd thought were mine to host, where James had carried me over the threshold as a bride who'd believed she was home forever. I still had my key, but using it felt like trespassing in reverse, reclaiming something that legally belonged to me but felt emotionally forbidden. The house smelled different. Eleanor's perfume had replaced the lavender sachets I'd kept in the linen closets, and something about the air itself felt altered, as if ownership could change the molecular composition of home. "Eleanor," I called, my voice echoing in the foyer where family portraits still hung, pictures that would need to be renegotiated now that I knew who actually owned them. "It's Catherine. I'm here with Marcus Rivera." She emerged from the living room like a queen receiving unworthy supplicants, dressed in what looked like a designer afternoon outfit, despite the fact that it was barely noon. Eleanor had always been a woman who dressed for the life she felt entitled to live. "I thought I made myself clear about your deadline," she said, her voice carrying that familiar edge of irritation mixed with authority. "And Mr. Rivera, I'm surprised to see you here. Surely there's no legal reason for Catherine to return to this house." "Actually, Mrs. Sullivan," Marcus said, his professional demeanor settling around him like armor, "there are several legal reasons for Mrs. Walsh to be here, primary among them being that this is her house." Eleanor's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "Don't be ridiculous. I've already filed the preliminary paperwork with the county recorder. The property transfer is a matter of public record." "What property transfer would that be?" "The transfer from James's estate to his rightful heir, me." Marcus opened his briefcase with the deliberate care of someone who'd been looking forward to this moment for days. "Mrs. Sullivan, I think there's been a misunderstanding about the terms of your son's will." "There's no misunderstanding. James left everything to family, as was proper. Catherine was adequately provided for in other ways." "What other ways?" Eleanor waved her hand dismissively. "A small pension, I assume. Perhaps some personal effects. I wasn't concerned with the details of staff compensation." Staff compensation. Even now, standing in what was apparently my own living room, Eleanor couldn't bring herself to acknowledge that James had married me rather than employed me. "Mrs. Sullivan," Marcus said, pulling out a thick document bound in legal blue, "this is your son's last will and testament. Would you like me to read the relevant sections aloud, or would you prefer to review it yourself?" "I've already reviewed James's will. I was there when he signed it." "You were present when James signed a preliminary document, yes, but that wasn't his final will." Marcus held out the papers. "This is—" Eleanor took the document with the confidence of someone who'd never been wrong about anything important, scanning the first page with the casual attention of someone confirming details she already knew. Then her expression changed. The color drained from her face so completely that for a moment I worried she might faint. "This is a mistake," she whispered. "It's not a mistake. James wouldn't— he couldn't." She flipped through pages with increasing desperation, looking for the provisions she'd been so certain existed. "Where is the bequest to me? Where are the family holdings?" Page 7, paragraph 3. Marcus said quietly. "You are bequeathed your grandmother's first edition copy of Pride and Prejudice, which your son felt you would appreciate for its literary value." "A book?" Eleanor's voice rose to something approaching a shriek. "He left me a book? The rest of the estate, the house, the business holdings, all financial assets, transfers to his widow, Catherine Walsh Sullivan, with a few specific charitable bequests to organizations your son supported. Eleanor turned to stare at me, and I saw something in her eyes I'd never seen before. Genuine fear. You did this. You manipulated him while he was dying, turned him against his own family. Mrs. Sullivan, Marcus interjected, your son made these decisions over a period of months with full legal and medical documentation of his mental competency. He was very specific about his reasoning. What reasoning? Marcus turned to a marked page in the will. Would you like me to read his statement? Or would you prefer to read it yourself? Read it, Eleanor demanded, though her voice had lost its authoritative edge. Marcus cleared his throat and began. To my mother, Eleanor Sullivan, I leave you the book that best represents our relationship, a story about the consequences of pride and prejudice. You have made it clear throughout my marriage that you consider my wife beneath our family's standards. Your inability to see Catherine's worth says more about your limitations than hers. I hope that in time, you'll learn to value people for their character rather than their pedigree. However, I cannot entrust my wife's future security to someone who has never shown her respect. Eleanor swayed slightly, gripping the back of a chair for support. He can't have meant this. There's more, Marcus said. Would you like me to continue? No, I said quickly, watching Eleanor's face crumble with the realization of what she'd lost. I think that's enough. But Eleanor looked at me with an expression that was part hatred, part disbelief, and part something that might have been broken-hearted recognition of her own miscalculation. You've destroyed my family, she said quietly. Eleanor, I said gently, I didn't destroy anything. I just finally stopped pretending you were right about me. The silence stretched between us, filled with the weight of 15 years of mutual misunderstanding and the catastrophic reversal of everything Eleanor had believed about power, family, and her place in the world. Outside, autumn wind rattled the windows of my house, my home, my inheritance, protection that my husband had wrapped around me like armor against exactly this moment. But as I looked at Eleanor's devastated face, I realized that winning this battle felt less like victory than like the end of a war nobody should have had to fight in the first place. Eleanor stood in what I now knew was my living room for 30 seconds of absolute silence, her face cycling through expressions I'd never seen before. Shock, disbelief, calculation, and finally, something that looked almost like grief. Then she snapped back to herself with the precision of someone who'd spent a lifetime refusing to accept defeat. This will can be contested, she said, her voice regaining its edge. A dying man, heavily medicated, vulnerable to manipulation. Any court would question the validity of these decisions. Marcus smiled, and it wasn't a kind expression. Mrs. Sullivan, your son anticipated that exact argument, which is why he took very specific steps to document his mental acuity and decision-making process. He pulled out his phone and tapped the screen. James's voice filled the room, weak but unmistakably clear, recorded what must have been weeks before his death. This is James Sullivan, speaking on October 3rd with my attorney Marcus Rivera present as witness. I am of sound mind and body. Well, sound mind anyway, and I want to state clearly that my decisions regarding my estate are my own, made without coercion or undue influence from anyone. Eleanor's face went ashen. Even I felt shocked hearing my husband's voice again, speaking with the careful precision of someone ensuring there could be no misinterpretation. I am leaving the bulk of my estate to my wife Catherine because she is the person who has brought the most joy, comfort, and love to my life. She has cared for me through 15 years of illness without complaint, without asking for anything in return, and with a devotion I could never have imagined when I was healthy enough to take it for granted. The recording paused, and I heard James take a shaky breath before continuing. I am not leaving significant assets to my mother Eleanor because she has never accepted my wife as part of our family. She has consistently treated Catherine with disdain and has made it clear that she considers my marriage a mistake. I cannot trust someone with such judgment to protect the welfare of the person I love most. Marcus stopped the recording. The living room fell silent except for the tick of the grandfather clock that had belonged to James's father, the same clock Eleanor had probably been counting on inheriting along with everything else. There are 4 hours of similar recordings, Marcus said quietly. Your son was very thorough in documenting his reasoning. Eleanor sank into the wingback chair by the fireplace, the one she'd claimed as hers during every family gathering, the throne from which she'd presided over conversations that always seemed to exclude me. Now she looked small in it, diminished by the realization that her son's final judgment had been not just about money, but about her character. "He planned this," she whispered, "the preliminary will, making me think I'd inherited everything, letting me expose myself. He planned to protect his wife," Marcus corrected. "The rest was just documentation of why that protection was necessary." Eleanor looked at me with something approaching wonder. You knew all along that this would happen." "I didn't know anything," I said truthfully. "Until an hour ago, I believed everything you told me. I spent 3 days thinking my husband had left me with nothing." 3 days. Eleanor's laugh was bitter. "I had a week of thinking I'd finally gotten rid of you." "Eleanor, don't." She held up a hand, stopping whatever conciliatory words I'd been planning. "Don't try to comfort me, Catherine. You've won, completely and thoroughly. The least you can do is let me process my defeat without your pity." She was right, of course. Eleanor Sullivan had spent 60 years believing she was entitled to control her family's wealth, only to discover that her son had found her so lacking in basic human decency that he'd chosen to document her failures for legal posterity. My sympathy wouldn't make that revelation any less devastating. "What happens now?" Eleanor asked Marcus. "Legally, I mean. When do I need to vacate the property?" "Mrs. Sullivan, that's up to Catherine. The house belongs to her, but any timeline for transition is her decision." Both of them looked at me, waiting for a response I wasn't prepared to give. Eleanor had thrown me out with cruel efficiency, giving me 3 days to pack a life and find somewhere else to die. I could return the favor, assert my ownership with the same cold authority she'd used to destroy my security. It would be justice, and justice had been in short supply lately. Instead, I found myself thinking about James, about the man who'd loved me enough to spend his final weeks creating an elaborate legal structure to protect me from exactly this situation. What would he have wanted me to do with the power he'd given me? "Take the weekend," I said finally. "Pack whatever belongs to you personally. We'll figure out the rest after that." Eleanor stared at me as if I'd spoken in a foreign language. "You're giving me time. I'm giving you dignity. The same dignity you should have given me." She was quiet for a long moment, studying my face as if seeing me clearly for the first time. Then she nodded slowly, perhaps recognizing something she'd been too proud to acknowledge before. "Catherine," she said, standing from the chair with the careful movements of someone who'd aged 10 years in 10 minutes, "I owe you an apology. You don't owe me anything. I do. I owe you 15 years of apologies. I spent your entire marriage believing you'd trapped my son, that you were after his money, that you weren't good enough for our family." She paused, her voice catching slightly. "But if you'd been after his money, you would have known about it. You would have protected yourself legally. The fact that you were blindsided by all this proves that money was never your motivation." It was more acknowledgement than I'd ever expected to receive from Eleanor Sullivan, and more honesty than I'd thought her capable of. "James saw who you really are," she continued. "I chose to see who I needed you to be to justify my prejudices. I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry for all of it." After she left, Marcus and I stood in the living room that was mine again, surrounded by furniture I could now afford to replace, and art I could finally admit I'd never particularly liked. "How do you feel?" he asked. I considered the question while looking out at the garden where I'd planted bulbs that would bloom in a spring I'd thought I'd never see from these windows. How did I feel? Vindicated? Wealthy? Confused? "I feel like a different person than I was an hour ago," I said finally, "and I'm not sure who that person is yet. Take your time figuring it out. You have resources now to become whoever you want to be." "Marcus, can I ask you something? Why did James do all this? The elaborate planning, the recordings, the test with Eleanor. Why not just leave me everything quietly?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, looking out at the garden where autumn leaves were falling like gold coins onto the lawn. "Because he knew that if you'd simply inherited unexpectedly, people would question whether you deserved it. But if you inherited after being tested by his mother's cruelty, if you inherited after proving your grace under pressure, no one could question that you'd earned every penny." I thought about the past week, the humiliation, the terror of homelessness, the crushing belief that 15 years of love had meant nothing to the man I devoted my life to caring for. It was cruel, I said. It was necessary. James knew his mother better than anyone. He knew she'd reveal her true feelings about you the moment he couldn't protect you. Now her behavior is legally documented and your character is proven. No one can ever question your right to his legacy. Outside, Eleanor's Mercedes pulled away from the house for the last time, carrying a woman who'd learned too late that cruelty had consequences even wealth couldn't protect you from. I stood in my living room, in my house, surrounded by my inheritance, and began to understand that James hadn't just left me money. He'd left me the power to rewrite the ending of my own story. The next week passed in a surreal haze of phone calls, paperwork, and the gradual comprehension of what it meant to be worth $87 million. Marcus introduced me to James's financial advisor, a sharp-eyed woman named Victoria Hayes, who spoke about investment portfolios and tax implications with the casual fluency of someone who dealt with absurd wealth as a daily routine. "Your husband was quite conservative in his approach," Victoria explained, as we sat in the mahogany-paneled office that James had visited monthly for 15 years. Diversified holdings, substantial liquid assets, real estate that appreciates steadily rather than dramatically. He built wealth designed to last generations, not to impress anyone. I studied the documents spread before me, quarterly reports showing returns on investments I'd never known existed, property deeds for buildings I'd never seen, statements from accounts that generated more in monthly interest than I'd earned in a year as a nurse. "This building," I said, pointing to a property listing in downtown Greenwich. "What is it?" "Commercial real estate. Your husband owned the entire block. Office buildings, retail spaces, that sort of thing. It's been managed by a property company for years, very hands-off, generates about $40,000 a month in rental income. $40,000 a month from a single property." I thought about my nursing salary, the way James and I had been careful about restaurant dinners and weekend trips, the modest lifestyle that I now realized had been completely voluntary. "Did he ever talk about why he kept our personal spending so conservative?" Victoria smiled. "He said he wanted to live the way normal people lived, not the way rich people were supposed to live. He was very concerned about maintaining perspective. Or perhaps protecting me from the knowledge that would have changed how I saw myself, how I moved through the world. James had been right. If I'd known about the wealth, I would have insisted on prenups and separate accounts, protected myself legally against exactly the accusations Eleanor had leveled. Instead, he'd given me 15 years of believing our marriage was about love rather than money, then ensured I'd never have to doubt which one mattered to him. "There is one item that requires immediate attention," Victoria said, pulling out a different folder. "The Patterson Foundation grant." "I'm sorry?" "Your husband established a charitable foundation 3 years ago, funded with $2 million. It's been dormant since his illness worsened, but the grant applications have continued arriving. You're now the sole trustee, which means decisions about funding rest with you." She handed me a stack of applications, dozens of requests from organizations seeking support for everything from cancer research to literacy programs to housing assistance for elderly women. James had been quietly giving away serious money, while I'd thought we were living on a carefully managed budget. How many of these did he usually approve? Most of them, actually. James was generous to a fault. His only requirement was that the organizations demonstrate real impact rather than just good intentions. I flipped through the applications, reading requests from hospice programs, medical research facilities, and something called the New Beginnings Initiative that provided transitional housing for recently widowed women. James had been thinking about women like me, women who might find themselves suddenly without resources, long before he'd gotten sick. "I'd like to approve all of these," I said, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. "And I'd like to increase the foundation's funding to $5 million annually." Victoria's eyebrows rose. "That's quite generous. I have quite a lot to be generous with." That evening, I sat in the kitchen, where I'd made thousands of meals, looking out at the garden where Eleanor had walked just a week ago as the presumptive owner of everything I could see. The house felt different now, not just because it was legally mine, but because I was beginning to understand that ownership carried responsibilities I'd never imagined. My phone rang. Sarah Martinez, the director of the hospice where James had spent his final weeks. "Catherine, I hope I'm not calling too late. I heard about James's passing, and I wanted to express my condolences again. He was a remarkable man. Thank you, Sarah. That means a lot. Actually, I'm calling because we received the most wonderful surprise today. A check from the Patterson Foundation for $50,000 to expand our family support services. James had applied for the grant months ago, but we'd given up hope when we hadn't heard anything. I smiled, looking at the application approval I'd signed that morning. I'm glad the foundation could help. Catherine, this funding is going to allow us to hire a full-time counselor specifically for family members dealing with terminal diagnoses. The support you provided James during his illness, that kind of dedicated caregiving, takes an enormous toll on the caregiver. We see so many spouses and adult children who sacrifice their own health and financial security to care for dying relatives. It's what people do for love. Yes, but love shouldn't require bankruptcy or complete self-sacrifice. This grant will help us provide resources so that families don't have to choose between caring for their loved ones and caring for themselves. After we hung up, I walked through the house that was slowly beginning to feel like mine rather than something I was borrowing. In James's study, I found the stack of papers he'd been working on during those final weeks. Not business documents, as I'd assumed, but research about caregiver support, elder care advocacy, the financial devastation that often followed serious illness. He'd been planning the foundation's expansion, thinking about how to use his wealth to prevent other families from facing the impossible choices that chronic illness forced on people who couldn't afford the luxury of unlimited care. Every grant application I'd approved that day had been on his preliminary list of organizations to fund. James had spent his final months not just protecting me from Eleanor's vindictiveness, but ensuring that his wealth would continue protecting other people facing similar struggles. The man who'd hidden his fortune from his wife during his lifetime had been planning to give most of it away after his death. I pulled out my laptop and began drafting an email to Victoria Hayes. If James wanted to help families facing medical crises, I could do more than approve his existing plans. I could expand them, amplify them, create something that would honor both his memory and the value of the care that had sustained us both through his illness. The New Beginnings Initiative would get a substantial endowment. The Hospice Family Support Program would receive funding for 5 years. And I would establish something new, a foundation specifically for women who found themselves widowed without resources, women who'd sacrificed their careers to care for dying spouses, women who faced the kind of financial vulnerability I'd briefly experienced before learning about James's protection. By midnight, I'd drafted plans for dispersing over $20 million in charitable grants. $20 million that would have bought Eleanor a lifetime of luxury, but would instead fund programs that made other people's lives more survivable during their worst moments. I thought about the recording Marcus had played, James's voice explaining that Eleanor couldn't be trusted with his legacy because she'd never valued the person he loved most. But his reasoning went deeper than protecting me from his mother's cruelty. He'd recognized that someone who couldn't see the worth in a devoted spouse probably couldn't be trusted to see the worth in anyone who didn't immediately benefit her. Eleanor would have hoarded the wealth, used it to maintain her position and comfort. James had chosen instead to leave it to someone who understood what it meant to care for other people without expecting anything in return. Outside my windows, autumn wind moved through the garden where I'd soon plant new flowers, flowers that would bloom in a spring I'd now be certain to see. The house settled around me with the comfortable sounds of a home that knew its occupant belonged there. I had work to do, foundations to run, grants to oversee, programs to develop that would help other women avoid the terror I'd experienced when Eleanor had tried to take away my security. But first, I had something more immediate to accomplish. I picked up the phone and dialed a number I'd memorized, but never called. Eleanor, it's Catherine. We need to talk. Eleanor arrived at my house, on Thursday afternoon, wearing the kind of understated designer outfit that cost more than most people's monthly salary, but somehow managed to look like mourning attire. She'd aged in the week since learning the truth about James's will, new lines etched around her eyes and a careful fragility in her movements that suggested someone still processing the magnitude of her miscalculation. "Thank you for seeing me," she said, as I led her to the sunroom where James and I had shared quiet afternoons during his illness. "I wasn't sure you would. I wasn't sure I should. We sat across from each other in the chairs where James and I had discussed everything except the fortune he'd been carefully protecting for me. Eleanor looked smaller than I remembered, diminished not just by the loss of wealth, but by the recognition of what her behavior had cost her. "I've been thinking about what you said," she began, her voice lacking its usual commanding edge. "About dignity. About the dignity I should have given you." "Eleanor, please, let me finish. I need to say this." She took a shaky breath. "I spent 15 years convincing myself that you'd trapped my son, that you were some kind of opportunist who'd manipulated a wealthy man into marriage. It was easier than admitting that James had found something with you that he'd never had with anyone else." I waited, watching her struggle with words that clearly didn't come naturally. "The truth is, Catherine, I was jealous. Not of your money. I never suspected there was money involved, but of how happy James was with you, of how he looked at you like you were the most important person in the world, of how you two had this partnership that I'd never had with anyone. Eleanor, you don't need to. I do need to, because what I did to you last week wasn't just cruel. It was the culmination of 15 years of smaller cruelties. Every family dinner where I excluded you from conversations. Every holiday where I made you feel like staff instead of family. Every time I treated you like an inconvenience instead of the woman who made my son happier than I'd ever seen him." She was right, of course. Eleanor's explosion after James's funeral hadn't come from nowhere. It had been the final expression of years of subtle dismissals and calculated slights that had made me feel perpetually uncertain of my place in the family. "I thought I was protecting James's legacy," she continued. "But I was really protecting my own pride. I couldn't bear that he'd chosen someone I considered beneath him, because it meant my judgment was wrong. And Eleanor Sullivan is never wrong. Was never wrong," I corrected gently. "Was never wrong," she agreed with a bitter smile. "But I was wrong about everything that mattered. You did love James for himself. You did take care of him without any expectation of reward. You did prove yourself worthy of the kind of love I always thought I deserved but never received." We sat in silence for a moment, autumn light filtering through the sunroom windows where James had spent his last good days reading while I worked in the garden. I could almost feel his presence, approving of this conversation that he'd probably hoped would happen eventually. "There's something else," Eleanor said, pulling a small wrapped box from her purse. "Something that belongs to you now, but that I'd like you to have from me rather than from lawyers and legal proceedings." She handed me the box, which was surprisingly heavy for its size. Inside, nestled in vintage velvet, was a ring, not the engagement ring James had given me, but something much older and more intricate, a sapphire surrounded by diamonds, set in platinum that had the patina of genuine age. "This was James's great-grandmother's ring," Eleanor explained. "It's been passed down to the wives of Sullivan men for 4 generations. I should have given it to you years ago, but I kept hoping." She stopped, unable to finish the sentence. "Hoping James would come to his senses and leave me? Hoping I'd been right about you, so I wouldn't have to admit I'd been wrong about everything else." She gestured toward the ring. "But you were already a Sullivan, Catherine. You became one the day you married James, not the day you inherited his money. I just refused to see it. I slipped the ring onto my right hand, feeling the weight of it, not just the physical weight of precious metals and stones, but the weight of acceptance that should have come 15 years ago. Eleanor, there's something I need to discuss with you. Something practical. Oh God, you're going to evict me, aren't you? I understand. I deserve it after what I did to you. I'm not going to evict you, but I am going to ask you to make a choice." I pulled out the folder of papers I'd been preparing since our phone call. "You're living in the apartment over the carriage house behind your old estate, correct? The one you've been renting month to month since you sold the main house?" "Yes. It's small, but adequate." "Eleanor, James owned that property, both the main house and the carriage house apartment. You've been paying rent to your own son for the past 5 years." The color drained from her face. "I don't understand." When you sold your estate, you sold it to James. He never told you because he knew you'd be humiliated, but he bought it through a shell company to ensure you'd always have somewhere to live. The rent you've been paying has been going into a trust account that he intended to return to you eventually." Eleanor stared at me as if I'd spoken in a foreign language. "James bought my house. He bought your house, employed a property management company to maintain it, and has been covering the difference between what you pay in rent and what the property actually costs to maintain. I handed her the property deed. You have two choices, Eleanor. You can continue living there as my tenant, in which case I'll honor the same arrangement James made. Or I can transfer ownership of the carriage house apartment to you, free and clear. It would be yours permanently. No rent, no strings attached. A place where you'd always be secure, regardless of what happens with anything else. Eleanor looked at the deed in her hands, then back at me, with an expression of complete bewilderment. Why would you do that? Because James loved you, even when you made it difficult, and because security shouldn't depend on someone else's goodwill. I learned that lesson pretty thoroughly last week. Catherine, I can't accept this. Not after what I did to you. You're not accepting it from me. You're accepting it from James. This is what he wanted, for you to be taken care of, but in a way that preserved your dignity and independence. Eleanor was quiet for a long time, studying the legal documents that would guarantee her housing for the rest of her life. When she finally looked up, her eyes were bright with tears she was trying not to shed. He really did think of everything, didn't he? He really did. And you're willing to honor his wishes, even after what I put you through? I thought about the question, looking out at the garden where Eleanor would never again walk as the presumptive owner of everything I could see. She'd cost me a week of terror and humiliation, but James had ensured it was only a week, and perhaps more importantly, her cruelty had finally, definitively, proven to everyone, including herself, exactly who deserved what in the Sullivan family legacy. I'm willing to honor what's right, I said finally, for James, for you, and for the woman I want to be now that I have the power to choose. Eleanor signed the papers with shaking hands, officially accepting ownership of the home James had been secretly providing her all along. As she prepared to leave, she paused at the sunroom door. Catherine, will you let me know about the funeral arrangements for the ring, when you pass it on to the next generation? I looked down at the sapphire that caught the afternoon light like captured sky. Eleanor, I don't have children to pass it on to. No, but you'll have someone. Women like you always find someone to care for, someone to love. When that time comes, I hope you'll remember that this ring represents more than jewelry. It represents the kind of love that protects people, even when they don't deserve it. After she left, I sat in the sunroom holding the ring that was now mine by right rather than exclusion, thinking about the woman who'd given it to me and the man who'd made it possible. James had been protecting Eleanor too, in his way. Not from the consequences of her cruelty, but from the destitution that might have followed if she'd ever truly been cut off from family support. Some love really was strong enough to survive death, betrayal, and the worst impulses of the people it tried to shelter, even when those people spent years proving they didn't deserve it. The phone call came at 7:30 the next morning while I was having coffee in the breakfast nook, where James and I had shared thousands of quiet mornings. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but the voice on the other end was unmistakably familiar. Mrs. Sullivan, this is Detective Ray Morrison with Greenwich Police. I'm calling about Eleanor Sullivan. My heart dropped. Is she all right? She's fine, ma'am, but she's here at the station. She came in voluntarily about an hour ago, says she needs to report a crime. A crime? She claims she unlawfully evicted you from your property last week and wants to file charges against herself for several things. Trespassing, theft of personal property, harassment. She's very insistent that we arrest her. I set down my coffee cup, trying to process what the detective was telling me. Detective Morrison, I think there's been some confusion. That's what I told her, ma'am. But she's got all these documents with her, recordings on her phone, legal papers. She says she has evidence of multiple felonies she committed and demands that we prosecute her to the full extent of the law. Eleanor was trying to have herself arrested. I thought about our conversation yesterday, about the weight of guilt and shame that had been evident in every careful word. Apparently, receiving the carriage house deed hadn't been enough to absolve her conscience. Detective, Mrs. Sullivan has been under tremendous stress recently. She lost her son last week, and there's been some family confusion about estate matters. I don't think she's thinking clearly. Ma'am, with respect, she seems pretty clear to me. She's got dates, times, witness statements she recorded on her phone. She even brought a copy of some text messages she sent you that she says constitute criminal harassment. The text messages. Eleanor had saved evidence of her own cruelty, probably as proof of what she'd accomplished when she thought she was finally rid of me. Now she wanted to use that same evidence to punish herself. Detective, I have no interest in filing charges against Mrs. Sullivan. The situation has been resolved privately. That's what I figured. But she says it doesn't matter whether you want to press charges. Says some crimes are too serious for the victim to just forgive, that the state has an obligation to prosecute regardless of your wishes. I rubbed my forehead, feeling a headache building behind my eyes. Where is she now? Conference room B, writing out a full confession. She's been here 3 hours and she's not budging. Says she won't leave until we formally arrest her. I'll be right there. The Greenwich Police Station was a modern building that managed to look both official and welcoming, the kind of place where serious crimes were rare enough that the staff could afford to be puzzled rather than jaded. Detective Morrison was a man in his 40s with kind eyes and the patient demeanor of someone who'd learned to handle unusual situations with grace. She's been writing for 3 hours straight, he told me, as he led me through the station. Most detailed confession I've ever seen. She's documented every interaction she had with you since your husband's funeral, with timestamps and locations. It's either the work of someone having a complete breakdown or someone with an exceptionally guilty conscience. Through the conference room window, I could see Eleanor hunched over a legal pad, writing with the focused intensity of someone trying to capture every detail of her own wrongdoing. She looked up when Detective Morrison knocked, and I saw relief flood her face when she saw me. Catherine, thank God. Tell him about what I did to you. Tell him about the eviction and the threats and the way I treated you. Eleanor, what are you doing? I'm confessing to crimes I committed. Real crimes, Catherine. What I did to you wasn't just cruel. It was illegal. I unlawfully evicted you from your own property. I stole personal belongings. I threatened and harassed you. These are felonies. She gestured to the pages of handwritten text. I've documented everything. Every conversation, every threat, every moment when I abused the power I thought I had. I committed serious crimes against you, and I need to face the consequences. Detective Morrison looked between us with the expression of someone trying to navigate a situation they'd never encountered before. Mrs. Sullivan, as I explained to your daughter-in-law, the victim would need to file a complaint for us to pursue charges. The victim doesn't get to decide whether crimes are prosecuted, Eleanor said firmly. That's not how the law works. If I robbed a bank, you wouldn't ask the bank's permission to arrest me. Ma'am, family disputes are different. This wasn't a family dispute. This was elder abuse, financial exploitation, criminal harassment. Eleanor's voice was getting stronger, more insistent. I researched the statutes, Detective. What I did to Catherine meets the legal definition of multiple felonies. I sat down across from Eleanor, studying her face. This wasn't a breakdown. It was something else entirely. This was a woman who'd spent a week living with the consequences of her own cruelty and found them unbearable. Eleanor, why are you really here? Because I can't live with what I did to you. Because giving me the carriage house yesterday just made it worse. It proved that you're exactly the kind of person I should have recognized all along, and I'm exactly the kind of person who destroys good people for my own benefit. So you want to go to prison? I want to face consequences that match what I did. Real consequences, not just embarrassment and regret. Detective Morrison excused himself, leaving us alone in the conference room with Eleanor's confession and the weight of everything that had brought us to this moment. Eleanor, James didn't set up that elaborate legal structure so you'd go to prison. He set it up so you'd learn something. I learned that I'm a terrible person who spent 15 years tormenting someone who never deserved it. You learned that actions have consequences. You learned that cruelty eventually costs more than kindness. You learned that the woman you dismissed as worthless was actually the one person your son trusted with everything he'd built. I paused, watching her absorb this. Those are valuable lessons, but they don't require incarceration. Then what do they require? I thought about the question, looking at this woman who'd spent years making me feel unwelcome in my own family, and was now desperate to punish herself for the pain she'd caused. They require you to do better, to be better, to use what you've learned to help other people instead of hurting them. How? I pulled out my phone and scrolled to the email I'd received that morning from the hospice director. Sarah Martinez contacted me about expanding their family support services. They need volunteers to help families navigate the emotional and financial challenges of terminal illness. People who understand what it's like to watch someone you love face death. Eleanor stared at me. You want me to volunteer at the hospice? I want you to use your experience for something meaningful. You've learned what it feels like to lose everything through your own choices. Maybe you can help other families avoid making the same mistakes. Catherine, I don't know if I'm qualified to help anyone. Eleanor, you spent 60 years believing you deserved things simply because of who you were born to be. Now you've learned what it feels like when that's taken away. That's exactly the kind of perspective that could help families who are facing loss. She was quiet for a long time, considering this alternative to the self-imposed punishment she'd been planning. Would you put in a good word for me? With the hospice? I'll do better than that. I'll work with you. The Patterson Foundation is funding their expansion, and I'm going to be directly involved in developing their programs. You'd work with me? After everything? I looked at Eleanor, really looked at her, seeing not the imperious woman who'd tried to destroy my security, but someone who'd been humbled into recognizing her own capacity for cruelty and was genuinely trying to find a way to atone for it. Eleanor, James loved you despite your flaws, not because you didn't have any. Maybe it's time I learned to do the same. Detective Morrison returned to find us discussing volunteer schedules and training programs. Two women who'd been enemies a week ago, planning to work together, helping families navigate the kind of crisis that had brought out both the worst and best in each of us. So we're not arresting anyone today? He asked hopefully. No arrests necessary, I said. Mrs. Sullivan has found a better way to serve her sentence. As we left the station together, Eleanor walking beside me with something that looked like peace settling over her features, I realized that James's final gift hadn't just been financial security. It had been the opportunity to discover who I could become when I had the power to choose mercy over vengeance, grace over justice, transformation over punishment. Some victories were worth more than money, even $87 million worth. 6 months later, I stood in the lobby of Sullivan House, the former Patterson Foundation building that I'd purchased and renovated as headquarters for our expanded charitable operations, watching Eleanor lead her third training session for new hospice volunteers. She stood before a group of 12 people, her silver hair catching the afternoon light, as she spoke with quiet authority about the challenges families face during end-of-life care. The most difficult part, she was saying, isn't watching someone you love die. It's watching yourself become someone you don't recognize in the process. Grief makes us desperate, and desperation makes us cruel to the people who least deserve it. She caught my eye through the glass conference room door and offered a small smile. Not the brittle social expression she'd worn for 15 years, but something genuine and hard-earned. Eleanor had thrown herself into the hospice work with the same intensity she'd once devoted to social status, but now that energy was directed toward helping other families avoid the mistakes she'd made. Mrs. Sullivan, my assistant, Linda Chen, a recent nursing school graduate I'd hired to help coordinate our growing programs, appeared at my elbow. The documentary crew is ready for your interview. The 60 Minutes piece about James's estate planning had generated unexpected interest in what journalists were calling posthumous protection strategies. Now, a PBS crew was producing a feature about charitable foundations that addressed the intersection of grief, family dynamics, and financial vulnerability. They wanted to interview me about the Patterson Foundation's evolution and its focus on supporting caregivers. But first, I had a more personal interview to conduct. The woman waiting in my office was familiar from the dozens of applications we'd received since the media coverage began. Sandra Mitchell, 68, recently widowed after 43 years of marriage. Her husband had died of Alzheimer's after a 7-year decline that had consumed their retirement savings and left her with substantial debt and no family support. Mrs. Sullivan, she said, standing as I entered, I can't thank you enough for agreeing to see me personally. Please call me Catherine. And you don't need to thank me. Helping families like yours is exactly why we created these programs. Sandra's story was heartbreakingly familiar. A devoted wife who'd sacrificed her own career advancement to care for a declining husband. Children who lived across the country and sent Christmas cards but no support. In-laws who'd been present for the inheritance discussion but absent for the caregiving years. When her husband finally died, Sandra had discovered that his family intended to contest the will, claiming she'd manipulated him during his illness. "They're saying I isolated him from his family," Sandra explained, her voice shaking slightly. "But his family never visited. I was the only one who was there for the night terrors, the wandering episodes, the day he forgot who I was entirely." I'd heard variations of this story dozens of times since establishing our caregiver support program. Dedicated spouses who provided years of unpaid care, only to be portrayed as predatory when inheritance questions arose. The Patterson Foundation had already provided legal support for 37 families facing similar challenges, and we'd won every case. Sandra, have you had a chance to review the legal brief our attorneys prepared? Yes, and I don't understand how they can be so confident. My stepchildren have expensive lawyers, and they're claiming I prevented their father from having proper medical care to preserve my inheritance. But you have documentation of every medical decision, every doctor's visit, every treatment option you pursued on his behalf? Of course. I kept detailed records because I wanted to make sure I was doing everything possible for him. Then you have nothing to worry about. Devoted caregivers keep records because they're focused on providing good care. People with ulterior motives don't document their actions so meticulously. I handed her the folder our legal team had prepared, a comprehensive defense strategy based on the same principles Marcus had used to protect my inheritance from Eleanor's challenges. When someone provided years of unpaid care while maintaining detailed medical records, their motives were self-evident. Sandra, there's something else I want to discuss with you. After we resolve the legal challenges, and we will resolve them, I'd like you to consider joining our team. Your team? We're developing a mentorship program pairing women who've successfully navigated caregiver legal challenges with others facing similar situations. Your experience would be invaluable to families just beginning this process. You want me to help other people fight inheritance disputes? I want you to help other people avoid the isolation and self-doubt that makes these disputes possible in the first place. When families try to portray caregivers as manipulative, they're counting on those caregivers to feel too guilty or overwhelmed to fight back effectively. Sandra was quiet for a moment, considering this possibility. What would that involve? Training, support, and the satisfaction of knowing your experience is preventing other women from facing these battles alone. Plus, it comes with a salary commensurate with the value you're providing. A salary? Sandra, you spent 7 years providing professional-level care without compensation. It's time your expertise was properly valued. After Sandra left, I prepared for the PBS interview, reviewing talking points about the Foundation's expansion and our success rate in protecting caregiver rights. But the questions the producer asked were more personal than I'd expected. "Catherine," she said as cameras rolled, "you've described your own experience as a wake-up call about the vulnerability of devoted spouses. But wasn't it also a betrayal? Your husband allowed you to believe you'd been left with nothing, let you experience genuine terror about your security. Some people might say that was cruel." I considered the question, thinking about that awful week when I'd believed James had abandoned me, when Eleanor's cruelty had felt like the final verdict on my worth as a person. "James knew something I didn't understand at the time," I said finally. "He knew that if I inherited his wealth without first proving I could survive its loss, people would always question whether I deserved it. By allowing me to face Eleanor's worst behavior and respond with grace, he gave me something more valuable than money. He gave me the moral authority to use his legacy however I thought best. And how are you using it?" I gestured toward the conference room where Eleanor was still leading her training session. Her former arrogance transformed into genuine empathy for families facing impossible choices. "James left me wealthy enough to be generous and strong enough to be just. His estate isn't just supporting individual families. It's changing how we think about the value of caregiving, the rights of devoted spouses, and the responsibility that comes with real love." Do you think he planned all this? The foundation work, the legal advocacy, even your relationship with his mother? I thought about the recordings Marcus had played, about James's careful voice explaining his reasoning for the elaborate protection he'd built around me. Had he known I'd use his wealth to help other women facing similar challenges? Had he anticipated that Eleanor would eventually find redemption through service? I think James knew me better than I knew myself. He knew that given resources and security, I'd want to help other people find the same protection. He knew that Eleanor, stripped of her pretenses and forced to confront her own capacity for cruelty, might become someone capable of genuine compassion. So his death wasn't just the end of your marriage, it was the beginning of something else. His death was the beginning of my understanding that some love really is strong enough to survive anything: betrayal, cruelty, even death itself. When someone loves you that completely, they don't just leave you their money, they leave you their faith in who you can become. The interview concluded as afternoon light slanted through my office windows, illuminating the framed photograph on my desk, James and me on our last anniversary, both of us knowing without saying that it would be our final celebration together. He looked tired but content, secure in whatever preparations he'd made for my future. Eleanor knocked on my door as the film crew packed their equipment. "How did it go?" she asked. They asked good questions, difficult ones, about James's planning, about forgiveness, about whether some betrayals can become gifts, given enough time and perspective. Eleanor was quiet for a moment, looking out at the early spring garden visible through my office windows. "Do you think he forgave me? Before he died?" "Eleanor, he made sure you'd be housed and cared for regardless of how you treated me. He gave you every opportunity to prove you were worthy of his love, even when you were determined to prove the opposite. But I failed the test. You failed the first test. But James knew there would be other tests, other chances to choose kindness over cruelty. He built protection for both of us, me from your anger and you from your own worst impulses." She nodded slowly, perhaps finally beginning to understand that her son's final gift hadn't been punishment for her failures, but hope for her eventual redemption. "Catherine, there's something I need to tell you, something I should have said months ago." "What's that?" "I'm proud to be your family, not because you inherited James's money, but because you've used it to become the kind of woman who makes being a Sullivan mean something worth respecting." As Eleanor left to prepare for the evening's caregiver support group meeting, I sat in my office thinking about the conversation, about pride and family, and the unexpected ways that love could transform even the most damaged relationships. Outside my window, the garden James had helped me plant years ago was showing signs of new growth. Bulbs we'd put in the ground together, emerging as proof that some things survived the harshest winters to bloom more beautifully than ever. The call that changed everything came on a Tuesday morning in late spring, while I was reviewing grant applications in my office at Sullivan House. Marcus Rivera's voice carried an urgency I'd never heard before. "Catherine, we need to talk. Immediately. Something's come up regarding James's estate, something I never expected to encounter." "What kind of something?" "The kind that requires a face-to-face conversation. I'm driving to you now." An hour later, Marcus sat across from my desk with a briefcase and an expression that mixed excitement with concern. On the conference table, he spread out documents that looked both official and somehow ominous. "Catherine, what do you know about James's business activities in the last year of his life?" "Very little. He stepped back from active management when the treatments became more intensive. I assumed his partners were handling everything. They were. But James was also doing something else, something he kept completely separate from his regular business operations." Marcus pulled out a thick folder. "He was quietly purchasing property. A lot of property." "What kind of property?" "Apartment buildings, mostly. Older buildings in working-class neighborhoods that were being targeted for gentrification. He bought them through shell companies to prevent speculation and price inflation." I stared at the documents, trying to process what Marcus was telling me. "How many buildings?" 47 properties across Connecticut and New York, nearly 2,000 rental units. Marcus opened his laptop and showed me a spreadsheet that made my head spin. "Catherine, James spent the last year of his life assembling what amounts to an affordable housing empire." "An empire?" "Properties worth approximately $43 million, generating rental income while providing stable housing for families who would otherwise be displaced by gentrification. And all of it was structured to transfer to you, upon his death, with very specific instructions about how it should be operated." Marcus handed me a sealed letter with my name written in James's familiar handwriting. He left this with instructions that it should only be given to you after the primary estate issues were resolved, and you'd had time to understand your new financial position. I opened the letter with shaking hands, seeing James's careful script on pages that felt like messages from beyond the grave. "My dearest Catherine, if you're reading this, it means Marcus has determined you're ready to understand the full scope of what I've tried to build for you. The houses, the investments, the foundation. Those were meant to give you security and the resources to help individual families facing crisis. The properties described in this folder are meant for something larger. They represent my attempt to address the systemic problems that create those crises in the first place. I spent months researching the connection between housing instability and family breakdown during medical crises, families forced to move during treatment, elderly people priced out of neighborhoods they've lived in for decades, adult children unable to provide care for parents because they can't afford to live nearby. These buildings are my answer to those problems. Stable, affordable housing operated not for maximum profit, but for community benefit. I've structured everything so that you can maintain the properties indefinitely while providing housing security for families who need it most. I know this is a tremendous responsibility to place on your shoulders. But Catherine, if anyone can transform real estate into something that actually serves people rather than displacing them, it's the woman who spent 15 years turning our house into a home that sheltered more than just us. The choice of what to do with these properties is yours entirely. You could sell them and use the proceeds for the foundation. You could operate them traditionally for maximum return. Or you could try something unprecedented, housing as a form of social service rather than profit extraction. Whatever you choose, know that I have complete faith in your judgment. You understand better than anyone what it means to create spaces where people feel safe and valued. All my love, James. I set down the letter, looking at Marcus, who was watching my face with careful attention. $43 million in real estate, I said slowly, with instructions to operate it as affordable housing. More than that, James researched cooperative housing models, community land trusts, rent stabilization programs. He consulted with urban planners and housing advocates. This wasn't just philanthropy. It was a comprehensive approach to preventing displacement. Marcus, I don't know anything about property management, tenant relations, housing policy. You don't need to. James assembled a team of experts who've been managing the properties since he acquired them. They've been waiting for you to decide whether to continue the project or dissolve it. Marcus pulled out another folder. Catherine, there's something else. Something about the financial projections that James wanted you to understand. What kind of projections? If you operate these properties as affordable housing with rent controls and tenant protections, you'll break even financially. No profit, but no loss. However, if you were to convert them to market-rate housing in today's real estate environment, he showed me numbers that made my breath catch. You'd be looking at returns of approximately 12 to 15 million annually. James deliberately chose properties that could be extremely profitable if operated without concern for tenant displacement. So he left me a choice, profit or principles. He left you power. The power to determine whether $43 million worth of real estate serves tenants or investors, whether 2,000 families have housing stability, or whether they become casualties of neighborhood gentrification. I walked to my office windows, looking out at the street where construction crews were working on yet another luxury development that would house fewer families than the working-class apartments it had replaced. Greenwich was beautiful and prosperous, but even here, housing costs were pricing out the teachers, nurses, and service workers who kept the community functioning. Marcus, if I chose to continue James's plan, operate the properties as affordable housing, what would that actually look like? Community-controlled rent stabilization, tenant ownership opportunities, preference for teachers, healthcare workers, and other essential workers. Housing specifically designed to support multi-generational families so that elderly parents can age in place near their children. And the financial sustainability? The properties generate enough rental income to cover maintenance, improvements, and property taxes. You wouldn't make money, but you wouldn't lose it either. James structured it so that affordable housing could be economically viable without being economically extractive. I thought about Sandra Mitchell and the dozens of other women I'd met through the foundation, caregivers who'd bankrupted themselves providing care because they couldn't afford to live near the family members who needed them. I thought about Eleanor's volunteer work at the hospice, where she regularly met families whose housing instability complicated their ability to provide end-of-life care. I want to see the properties, I said. All of them. I want to meet the tenants, the property managers, the team James assembled. I want to understand what he built before I decide what to do with it. Catherine, are you sure? This is a massive undertaking. Even with the existing management team, overseeing affordable housing for 2,000 families would be essentially a full-time job. Marcus, 6 months ago, I thought I was a broke widow whose husband had left her homeless. Today, I'm worth over $100 million and running a foundation that's helped dozens of families protect their caregivers from inheritance disputes. I picked up James's letter, rereading his words about housing as social service rather than profit extraction. I think I can handle expanding my mission to include housing justice. And if the financial projections are wrong, if the properties become money pits rather than break-even operations, I thought about Eleanor's confession at the police station, about her desperate need to face consequences that matched her actions, about James's recording explaining that some people couldn't be trusted with wealth because they'd never learned to value the people affected by their choices. Then I'll learn something valuable about the difference between using money and letting money use me. Marcus smiled, the expression of a lawyer who'd spent months wondering if his client would be worthy of the trust her husband had placed in her. When do you want to start the property visits? Tomorrow. And Marcus, I want Eleanor to come with me. Eleanor? She spent 60 years believing that wealth entitled her to ignore other people's needs. Maybe it's time she learned what it looks like when wealth is used to meet those needs instead. That evening, I called Eleanor to explain about the properties, about James's housing project, about the choice I was facing between profit and principles. $43 million, she said quietly. James spent his final year buying apartment buildings for poor people. He spent his final year trying to solve the housing crisis that makes family care impossible for working-class families. And you're going to continue his project? I'm going to try, but I want you to help me understand what I'm taking on. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice carried something I'd never heard from her before, genuine humility mixed with pride. Catherine, my son was a better man than I ever gave him credit for, and you're a better woman than I ever allowed myself to see. Eleanor, will you help me? I'll help you honor the legacy James actually wanted to leave. Not just money, but mercy. Not just wealth, but wisdom about how wealth should be used. Tomorrow we would begin visiting properties, meeting tenants, learning what it meant to transform real estate from investment commodity into community resource. Tonight, I sat with James's letter and began to understand that his final gift wasn't just financial security, it was the opportunity to discover what happened when someone with resources chose to use them for justice rather than accumulation. Some inheritances were worth more than their dollar value. Some legacies were measured in lives protected rather than profits generated. And some love was so complete that it continued creating opportunities for grace long after the lover had died. 3 years later, I stood on the roof garden of Riverside Apartments, one of James's housing properties that we'd transformed into a model for community-controlled affordable housing, watching Eleanor lead a group of elderly residents through the morning Tai Chi class she'd started 6 months ago. The garden itself was proof of what happened when tenants became partners rather than customers. Vegetables thriving in raised beds, flowers that bloomed year-round in the greenhouse the residents had built together, children's playground equipment surrounded by benches where 3 generations gathered every evening. Mrs. Sullivan? Maria Santos, the property manager we'd hired from the community rather than from corporate real estate, appeared at my elbow. The documentary crew is ready for the final interview. The BBC team had been following our housing project for 18 months, documenting what they called an experiment in inherited wealth as social justice. Today, they were filming the conclusion of their series about the transformation of James's properties from simple, affordable housing into what housing advocates were calling a new model for community-controlled residential stability. But first, I had a more important meeting. Dr. Patricia Williams, Director of Geriatric Services at Greenwich Hospital, had requested time to discuss something she described as a proposal that could revolutionize how we think about aging in place. She arrived carrying blueprints and wearing the excited expression of someone who'd discovered a solution to a problem that had seemed intractable. "Catherine," she said, spreading architectural drawings across my desk, "what would you say to creating the first fully integrated aging-in-place community in Connecticut?" I'd say, "Tell me more." "We've been studying the success of your housing properties, particularly how you've structured them to support multi-generational families. What if we took that model and expanded it? Purpose-built housing designed specifically to allow elderly residents to age in their own homes with family nearby. She pointed to the drawings. Apartment buildings designed with wider hallways, accessible bathrooms, and common areas that facilitated both independence and community support. Ground floor units for seniors with mobility challenges, family-sized apartments on upper floors so adult children can live in the same building as their aging parents, shared spaces that encourage intergenerational connection. And the financial model? Same as your existing properties, community-controlled rent stabilization, tenant ownership opportunities, preference for families committed to long-term community membership. But Patricia, Dr. Williams paused, studying my face. This would require a significant additional investment. We're talking about new construction, not renovation of existing properties. I thought about the conversation I'd had with Marcus just last week, reviewing the foundation's expanded assets. James's original estate had continued growing through careful investment management, and our housing properties had proven more successful than anyone had projected. Families with stable housing were more financially secure, more able to support elderly relatives, less likely to face the crises that had originally brought them to our attention. How significant an investment? $15 million for the first phase. 24 units designed specifically for multi-generational families dealing with aging and care needs. $15 million. 3 years ago, that number would have seemed impossible, incomprehensible. Now it felt like an opportunity to prove that James's faith in my judgment had been justified. Dr. Williams, where would you build this? We've identified a site in Bridgeport, working-class neighborhood, close to public transportation, walking distance from the hospital. The kind of community where families want to stay but can't afford to as property values rise. Do it. Just like that. Just like that. With 2 conditions. The project gets managed by the same community-controlled model we've developed for the other properties, and Eleanor Sullivan gets to help design the programming for intergenerational community building. After Dr. Williams left, I prepared for the BBC interview, thinking about how to explain what we'd learned in 3 years of trying to use inherited wealth for community benefit. The interviewer, a sharp-eyed woman named Sarah Kim, who'd covered housing justice issues across Europe, asked the questions I'd been expecting, and a few I hadn't. "Catherine," she said as cameras rolled, "you've described this housing project as fulfilling your late husband's vision. But hasn't it also become something larger than individual philanthropy? Something that challenges how we think about property ownership itself? James left me resources and a choice about how to use them. But the tenants in these buildings, they're the ones who transformed his vision into community reality. When people have stable housing and a voice in how their homes are managed, they create something that benefits everyone. Critics might say you're simply a wealthy widow playing at social work, that real housing justice requires systemic change, not charity from philanthropists." I'd heard this criticism before, usually from housing advocates who'd initially been skeptical about our project. "Sarah, I think there's a difference between charity and justice. Charity gives people what you think they need. Justice gives people the power to determine what they need and the resources to achieve it. And you believe your approach represents justice? I believe our approach represents one small experiment in what becomes possible when wealth serves community rather than accumulating for its own sake. Whether it's justice, that's for the tenants to decide, not me. What would your husband think about what you've built here?" I looked out the window toward the community garden where Eleanor was now helping children plant seeds in the beds their grandparents had prepared. 3 years ago, Eleanor had been a woman consumed by entitlement and prejudice. Today, she was someone who understood that belonging required contribution, that respect required service. I think James would be amazed by what's been accomplished here. Not just the housing stability or the community programming, but the way this project has changed everyone involved in it, including me. How has it changed you? It's taught me the difference between having money and being wealthy. Having money is a personal condition. Being wealthy is a community responsibility. That evening, after the film crew had packed their equipment and the interview was over, Eleanor and I sat in my office reviewing the plans for the Bridgeport project. At 78, she moved more slowly, but with greater purpose, her energy focused on the community programming that had become her specialty. "Catherine," she said, studying the architectural drawings, "I need to tell you something I should have said years ago." "What's that?" "When James first brought you home, I was terrified. Not because I thought you weren't good enough for him, but because I could see that you were exactly what he needed, someone who would love him for who he was, rather than what he could provide. I was afraid that kind of love would show me how empty my own life had become. She was quiet for a moment. Perhaps thinking about the woman she'd been before James's death had forced her to confront her own capacity for cruelty and change. I spent 15 years trying to prove you weren't worthy of my son's love. Instead, I proved I wasn't worthy of either of your forgiveness, but you gave it to me anyway, and that grace changed everything about how I understand what family means. Eleanor, we're family because we choose to be family, not because of bloodlines or inheritance, but because we've learned to value each other's growth. And that's what you've created with these housing communities, isn't it? Families of choice, people who stay connected because they support each other's flourishing rather than limiting it. Outside our windows, the lights of Greenwich twinkled like promises, each one representing a household navigating the complexities of love, care, and the challenge of building security that lasted across generations. Somewhere among those lights were families who'd benefited from our foundation's caregiver support services, tenants who'd found stability in housing that valued community over profit, elderly residents who were aging with dignity because their families could afford to live nearby. Eleanor, there's something I want to give you. I opened my desk drawer and pulled out a small velvet box containing the sapphire ring she'd given me after James's funeral, the Sullivan family ring that had been passed down for 4 generations. I can't accept this, she said immediately. That ring belongs to you now. It belongs to the woman who best represents what the Sullivan family should be. For 4 generations, it was passed to wives who were valued for their pedigree rather than their character. I think it's time that changed. I placed the ring in Eleanor's hands, watching her understand what I was proposing. Eleanor, you've spent 3 years proving that people can change, that wealth can serve justice, that family can be built through choice and service rather than just blood and inheritance. You've earned the right to carry this ring's legacy forward. But Catherine, I don't have children to pass it on to. Neither did I, 3 years ago. But we've both discovered that family extends far beyond biological connections. When the time comes, you'll know exactly who deserves to wear this ring next. Eleanor slipped the ring onto her finger, where it caught the light like captured sky. Thank you, Catherine, for the ring, for the forgiveness, for showing me what it means to use inherited privilege for something larger than personal comfort. As she prepared to leave, Eleanor paused at my office door. James left you more than money, didn't he? He left you proof that some love is strong enough to transform everyone it touches. After she was gone, I sat in my office thinking about the conversation, about inheritance and transformation, and the unexpected ways that loss could become the foundation for unprecedented growth. On my desk, James's letter lay open to the final paragraph I'd read hundreds of times, but never fully understood until tonight. Catherine, my greatest gift to you isn't the money. It's the faith that you'll use whatever I leave behind to become the woman you were always meant to be. Some people inherit fortunes. Others inherit the wisdom to transform fortunes into legacy. You, my beloved, inherit both. I looked out at the community we'd built, at the housing that provided stability, at the programs that protected families facing crisis, at the proof that inherited wealth could serve justice rather than perpetuating inequality. James had been right about more than just my worthiness to inherit his fortune. He'd been right about my capacity to transform that fortune into something that honored both his memory and the values we'd shared. Some love really is strong enough to survive death, betrayal, and the worst impulses of the people it protects. My husband didn't just leave me an inheritance. He left me proof that when you're finally free to choose who you become, love will always guide you toward justice. And justice, it turns out, is the only investment that pays dividends across generations. The end.